All right, I think we're going to start. So hello, everybody, and thank you all very much for being here today. My name is Benjamin Hoffman. I am an associate professor of French literature and the director of the Center of Excellence here at Ohio State. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Anna Klosowska from Miami University. Before presenting our guest, I would like to take a moment to thank the various people and institutions that made our visit to Columbus possible. Many thanks to the Department of French and Italian, and especially to our chair, Professor Sarah Grace Heller, for enthusiastically supporting our lecture series. I also wish to thank the French Cultural Services in the US and the Consulate of France in Chicago for providing us the support we needed. This event is also supported by various departments and centers here at Ohio State, including African American and African Studies, History, History of Art, Spanish and Portuguese, Germanic languages and literatures, Slavic and Eastern European languages and literatures, the Humanities Institute, and the Center for Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. Finally, I would like to take a moment to thank warmly the private donors who are supporting our lecture series. If you have already invested in the center, please know that we greatly appreciate your friendship, which makes events like this one possible. So at the end of this lecture, please stay for a reception in honor of our guests. Also, finally, please consider attending the final event of our lecture series, a presentation given by Professor Tilly Boone-Cuillet from Washington University in St. Louis on April 18 about the research on 18th century French culture. So, Anna Klosowska is professor of French at Miami University. Her recent co-edited volumes published by Cornell University Press and Punctum Books include Transhistorical, Gender Plurality Before the Modern, with Greta Lafleur and Masha Raskolnikov on history of trans and non-binary gender, as well as Disturbing Times, Medieval Past, Reimagined Futures, with Catherine Karkoff on medieval critical race studies. A book in progress, Remarkable Objects, Silk, Metal, Ceramics, Paper, Ivory, reimagines French cultural history through biographies of 5 objects from around the world. She's the author of Queer Love in the Middle Ages, published by Paul Grave in 2005, and she's also the editor and translator of Madeleine de Lobépin's selected poems, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2007. She also edited several collected volumes and journal issues, including Violence Against Women in Medieval, published in 2018 by the University Press of Florida. And she's also the author of more than 40 articles on numerous topics, including queer and trans studies, critical race studies, transnational feminism, postcolonial studies, and eco-criticism. She co-teaches a global book lab at Miami University, a collaboration between the Rare Books Collection, the Art Museum, and the college. Please join me in welcoming Professor Klosowska to Ohio State. It is a privilege to have her with us today.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? I tend to have a little Polish voice, so just thank you so much for inviting me today. Thank you to Benjamin Hoffman, Sarah Grace Heller, and the colleagues and graduate students whom I met today. I also wanted to give a shout out to the Latin and Old French reading groups, which have been such a wonderful resource for me. Leslie Lockett, Christopher Jones, Sarah Grace Heller, Genevieve Barrett. It's such an auspicious location and timing. When I was a visiting professor at Kenyon for 5 years, that was my first job out of graduate school. Laurie Fink, who's here, was my mentor, and Joan Cadden, the historian of queer sexuality. And this is about spring break at Kenyon, 2 weeks, by the way, go Kenyon. And we would meet on the first morning of that spring break, inevitably, Laurie and I, in this very building. So this is a very auspicious beginning. Thank you so much for being here. And I also want to mention that Laurie and her colleagues in Jewish, Welsh, and Middle English studies have sort of created post-colonial studies in the medieval, starting as early as 1990s. So I still remember being in Wales at a conference when somebody in the audience got up and said, but the empire was not so bad after all. So there's still a lot of work to do. I'll open by talking about this book that I have finished thanks to you, because I had a public to write for. So I'm really, really grateful for this invitation. And I worked on it for 5 years. So there are 5 chapters, as you have heard. And there are 4 principles for organizing principles of this book. I'm not going to spend too much time on them because that's, I think theory is boring in an open lecture, but I'm going to talk about sparkly objects more. But these 4 principles very quickly are, number 1, to find a richer, more fine-grained world based on Edward Said's observation that 19th century Orientalism prevents us from seeing regional and historical detail. It dumbs down art history. It impoverishes it because it oversimplifies. The second principle is complementary to the first. Some stories have been swept under the carpet. We have not been repeating them. And this is one of them that I've learned literally as I was working on this book. South of France, where you go for vacation, you meet someone, you fall in love, you take your children to Porquerolles. This is Ramatuelle, where all the nightclubs are. And this is a medieval Muslim area, as we know from at this point, mostly landscape, right? So Massif des Morts. What happened with that, with these inhabitants? Well, they kind of picked on the wrong guy. They controlled the St. Bernard Pass, which is the passage to Italy, and they happened to have captured for ransom no one less than the Abbot of Cluny, and that sort of put an end to their existence. The local lords got together and pushed them out, but there's still these marks in the landscape, and I didn't know about them. I've been working on the topic for 35 years, and it's only thanks to Mohamed Balan, who was trained in France, but is now working here in North America, that I've learned that history. So you can see how this is called État Corsaire here on this very old map. But here is Balan's, linked to his research and his better map and more capacious research on that. Ceramics sort of changed to glass, so this has transformed over the course of my sabbatical last year. But I wanted to start with ceramics. This was the first thing that I knew about Islamic art in medieval France. The Tunisian balls used as decoration in this case, in Utel. I made a little map of some of the other ones. This is very common in Pisa in the 11th century, 12th century, where Pisa becomes sort of this seafaring commercial empire. And there are thousands of them, in fact, in Pisa, and dozens, a few maybe in France, in these locales that are here marked on the map with the little blue dropped points. So they go all the way to the north of France as well. And obviously we have lost some of them, so we don't know how many of them were there. But I think they help us visualize the 2 organizational principles of these maritime networks. So in the Mediterranean, those would be Tunisian or African art inserted in European facades, while in the Indian Ocean, all along the coast of Zanzibar and the islands between Madagascar and the Arabian Peninsula, you see the same decoration all the way up until the 18th century, but those will be Chinese and Korean ceramics. So the same type of art gesture, right? But a different commercial network. So there are so many things that I never learned in graduate school. I wanted to write this book, not because I'm an expert on art history, Islamic art history, but because there's so many things that I've learned through this process. So that's number 2, the stories that we've forgotten. Number 3, it's a paradox. Mutual hostility and cultural influence coexist. And the 4th point of the book, rather than being part something, like I would be part Ukrainian, I don't see myself as part Ukrainian at all. I'm like whole Ukrainian. So I don't think that the math is right. It's not part something, but when you encounter another culture, you multiply. And there's a little glitch in monotheistic religions. You cannot accumulate them like you do in polytheism, but I think in fact people do. So this is the hypothesis of the book, that people are not part something, that they are multiple identities. And I'm not going to spend much time on those 4 theoretical points, but I wanted to give at least one salient example of each of those points. So for the first point, the need for a richer, more fine-grained knowledge of Africa and Afro-Eurasia, Hegel, as we all know, thought that Africa is a continent with no history, opening the possibility of Europeans owning it. And no right to self-determination. And this is also true of the cultures that, quote unquote, vanished or that lost that easy link to their past. For instance, in Turkey, with the use of the Latin alphabet, people have no longer the access to their history written in the Arabic alphabet. So For stories like that, I think we have to teach people how to decipher them and how to own them again. Second point, I often encounter in my graduate program students from Africa who have never read African literature. They know everything about French literature, but African literature is completely not taught. So that is something that we can actually do. And I've been training myself to do that. The second point, telling stories that did not fit in the oversimplified narrative. For instance, how many of you know that in the winter of 1543-44 in Toulon, there was a large Ottoman fleet, and that the local cathedral was converted into a mosque for their convenience. Now, this is a fact that we have never taught, but I think it's an important fact that will change the way we teach the history of French culture if we can only include facts like that. So the third point about hostility being no obstacle to assimilation, and that comes a little bit, from my own experience as a full, not part, but as fully Ukrainian. Each spring, the Ottoman army would move north to enslave Ukrainians, but that didn't prevent us. And Ukraine is very diverse at the time. It's polytheistic, Jews, they're Muslims. There are varieties of Christians, Orthodox, Protestant, Catholic. It's multi-language, it's multi-script. It celebrates the same holiday 2 weeks apart. So it's a very diverse area. And what does it do? It adopts Ottoman dress, food, tents, swords, horses, literature, Turkic and Arabic vocabulary, poetry. All of these become our own poetry and are contrasted with other imperial cultures like the Russians, the Swedes, the Germans, who periodically come in and then on the tide out carry everything with them that is of value and that they can that is not nailed down. So the third point is very important to me. Hostility is no obstacle to assimilation. And then finally, to have roots in plural religions and cultures is to emphatically reject the metaphor of being part of anything. And along these lines, that book, that I've been writing has led me to discover a lot of the new research, especially in art history, focused on materials that has completely transformed the way we look at medieval artifacts. I'm going to cite just two examples. Sarah Guérin's work on ivory, which has enabled us to see that, in fact, there was a connection with West and subtropical Africa, the bend of the Niger in the Middle Ages. And then Merovingian cloisonné. That's another example, one of my favorite examples. You all know the Merovingian jewelry with a garnet cloisonné, and we all thought they came from Bohemia, but in fact, the study, spectroscopy study from about 10 years back of all of the Saint-Denis collections, the ones who could be traced to Saint-Denis, shows that they were from Rajasthan, and these are Merovingian garnets. So they're not recycled garnets from the Roman Empire. They're not Bohemian, they're Rajasthan. So the medieval world is a lot more connected now we know than we previously thought. So before I start with the 5 chapters, I want to talk a little bit about terminology because I'm saying Afro-Eurasian. That seems to me more appropriate than Islamic art. In French, and this is a little French angle here, initially in the 1800s, l'art musulman, and then l'art islamique, was a label forged by Orientalist historians and collectors in the 1800s, and then used also in the 1900s to designate pre-modern art from the period of transition from late antiquity to the time of the death of the Prophet, 632, and ending in 1800. In Anglophone museums, this is also contemporary art, right? But and also in the 1800s in France, there's this romantic legend of Arabic origins of medieval French art, troubadour poetry, Arabic birth of the Gothic architecture. I have encountered that legend at every turn when I was working on my book. For instance, and it continues, I believe, to shape our understanding of Islamic art and of French medieval art. For instance, the art historian and later the first director of the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, I'm sure you're all familiar that it's the museum that has all the cast of medieval buildings. Camille Onlard, who is from a lawyer family from from Boulogne. He worked in medieval Cyprus for many years. And Enlard, who was a young art historian at the time, was also responsible for saving one of the objects that I'm writing about in my book, the Buktegin silk brocade, which was in the fair way to be, it's a contact relic, so it was going to be cut into little pieces and given to the parishioners when he got a hold of it for the Louvre. So in spite of this long history of French art history and medievalists working on Islamic art, my training as a medievalist did not explore this interwoven world of Jewish, Islamic, and French studies. And even though my medieval teachers were both immigrants, in fact, Michel-André Bossy was a descendant of 2 emperors of Constantinople. They were active in 1350s. So even he didn't teach me what I am now trying to desperately learn. And the other mentor was Jeanette Beer, a New Zealander, who devoted her career to translation, Translatio Studi, Translatio Imperii, that was her topic. And yet I was not able to, get the training that I needed to, perhaps teach others what I'm learning in this book. So I'm not going to pretend that I'm the first person here, right? Sharon Kinoshita has done it before. A master class on Islamic and Afro-Eurasian objects. That's the one that she was writing on. She juxtaposed the crusading ethos of the Song of Roland and the Eleanor vase, which you see here, as the token of diplomatic and military alliances by 2 counts of Poitiers just before Eleanor. The vase was in the treasury of Saint-Denis. Its core is a carved rock crystal ewer, perhaps from Iran, although perhaps also from Fatimid Egypt. This determination has to remain flexible. It's very hard to test crystal. It's a very pure material, so you can only test the occlusions. And in order to get at the occlusions, you have to drill, which no museum will let you do. British Museum actually drilled in their Aztec crystal rock skull because they were interested in how it was made, since there was no wheel at the time, apparently. So they actually have studied that and determined, and that again, this is why crystal is so hard. It would have come either from Brazil or from Madagascar. They don't know. So I think we just need more statistics on these materials. And Jeremy Jones at Oxford and Elise Morel, who is the Caligari Research Center experimental archaeologist, are working on exactly that project. So they had determined at this point that perhaps there is a tendency in Persian rock crystal carvings to do more vertical cuts and more angled cuts in the Fatimid world. Perhaps but they haven't published that research yet. That's just the initial hypothesis. So going back to Eleanor, this vase dates to approximately the 9th century and has this 12th century metal mount, which is inscribed in Latin: Hoc vas sponsa dedit anor regi Ludovico, mitadolus avo mihi regis sanctisque sugerus. So Eleanor gave this as a bridal gift to the King Louis. Mitadolus gave it to her ancestor, and the king gave it to me, Sujet, and Sujet gave it to the saints. Now, I'll let you draw your own conclusions. 1 line in Latin, 5 lines in English. Which language is superior? Mitadolus is Imad al-Dawla, supporter of the dynasty, paradoxically. Imad al-Dawla, Abdul Malik ibn Hud, who was the last emir of Saragossa, the Roman Caesarea Augusta, and he ruled from 1110 to 1130, but Almoravids moved in 1120, and so he allied himself with William of Poitiers, the grandfather of Eleanor, and then also with the Aragon Christian ruler, and then was able to recover Saragossa and rule there until 1130. So this vase really commemorates the alliance between a Muslim ruler and 2 Christian rulers to defend themselves against the invasion of Almoravid Muslim rulers, and also a pact between Aquitaine and France at the same time. Not a binary story in any sense, but it is taken as, and Kinoshita very cleverly juxtaposes it with the Song of Roland, which is very much a binary story. Christians are right, Muslims are wrong, right? So a different story emerges when you look at the artifacts from when you look at the texts in that particular case. So thanks to Kinoshita, everyone in French knows the story of Eleanor and her vase. Eleanor then becomes the grandmother to Louis IX. And I was just sharing with Professor Heller, the other day I was reading 17th century histories of Eleanor. People have such trouble making sense of her success, because if she is the grandmother of Saint Louis, she must have divorced the French king, legitimately. And if she divorced the French king, how can that be legitimate? Now, you have to remember that the dynasty just changed, and the Bourbons, who are in power in the 17th century, have their most recent link to the French royal family is Saint Louis. So Saint Louis becomes the patron saint of 17th and 18th century. Every king is named Louis. It's a massive investment in terms of production of poetry, production of manuscripts. And so they're very preoccupied with the idea of Eleanor being right or wrong in this patriarchal context. It's very funny. The pretzels that they twist themselves in order to document that the divorce was legitimate. So the Eleanor vase, part of perhaps some 500 pieces of fragments of carved crystal extant in museums from before 1500. And another example is also at the Louvre. This is the vase given by Roger II of Sicily to Thibaut de Champagne. You see here the thumb, the handle is broken off. And I wanted to show this particular object because it tells us so much about the value of these objects in inventories. It was already broken off in 1576. And here's another example. This was already broken in around 1300. You see that this vial is shaped like a fish. Fish is often associated with coolness, right? It sort of reminds you of being comfortable and cool in those desert climates. So it's very often the subject of glass and crystal rock carving and decoration. So here this fish has lost its head before it came to Europe. And this is very much how these objects circulated from Africa to Italy when they were mounted. This one perhaps mounted in Paris around 1300, just based on the style of the monture, of this little pendant, and then used and recorded as, so it was already broken when it got it in Europe. But that didn't prevent some very important royals, Marguerite de Flandre. In 1405, her inventory describes this as un petit cristal à façon de poisson garni d'argent à mettre relique. So they've been wearing it continuously, even though it was broken. And we see that a lot about Islamic objects in royal collections and in European collections generally. Some of them have already been broken when they got there. So going back to the Eleanor vase, a very large vase, 24 centimeters, quite an outstandingly large one. And what else can I tell you about those beautiful crystal objects? Well, that they are really that they're, the source of the crystal is probably Madagascar and Mayotte. We don't know very well. Zanzibar coast of Africa, and that they were traded via Sicily and southern Italy to Europe, where they were set in gilt bronze and sold as reliquaries and pendants all throughout the 11th and 13th century. So most of them probably are Fatimid, most of those 500 surviving pieces and fragments. Okay, so now, so you can imagine, you can see my difficulty, right? I thought I was writing a very simple book about 5 objects, but what I encountered as I was doing my research was this ever-transforming puzzle of Afro-Eurasia. I'm constantly trying to get a hold of the transforming political entities, dominant languages, cultures on which I'm not an expert. So come with me on this magic carpet. So there's one point, I think, that, and people ask me, why would you write a book like this if you're not, in fact, an art historian? So it's art historian without a license. And here's the answer. If you connect art history and regional French history, you can come up with interesting things. That was my assumption. And in fact, there is, thank God, at least one thing that I've discovered that nobody else in art history, Islamic art history, knows yet. And so I'm sharing it now. There's at least one finding I'm pretty confident about. It has to do with the glass chapter. The work of the chapter led me to a quite exceptional family in Douai. And they owned this now lost in the First World War cap on the left, which is very similar to the one on the right, which is called the Charlemagne cap. And it's decorated with this dot pattern. It's enameled glass. So glass that you fire, the blank, decorate, refire, super complicated things go wrong at every step. So it's a very finicky technique. And so this family, the Muley-Bodin clan, is not an aristocratic family. Poised at the threshold of the abundance of paper and spread of literacy, women from that elite urban family, or if you see it in another light, just a commonplace urban family, owned at least, they owned several French romances, pious books like Books of Hours and Psalters. The men owned, of course, they were trained as lawyers, so they owned the 5-volume set of Justinian, several of those sets. That is completely unprecedented at the time. Even bishops at the time may have like 1 or 2 of the volumes. The only person who owns multiple sets of the 5 volumes of Justinian, which is thousands of pages, is like the advisor to the Pope on legal matters. And he probably owns it because he has several residences all throughout Europe. So of course, in every one, he will have a set. So this family is quite spectacular. And they own not only the books, so women read, women pass each other books across generations. So they are documented from 1204 to 1330, the long 13th century, when we had no records of female literacy or women reading books or giving each other books at all in Northern Europe, almost. And so they own not only books, but also these small objects of Afro-Eurasian luxury trade, coconut cups, metal cups, glass cups, diamonds. And although they own them on a much smaller scale than in the inventories of the royal families or the counts of Flanders, there will be hundreds of these objects in those inventories, Charles V or the Count of Flanders, and these people will have 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe. And so the scale is completely different, but this is the canary in the mine. And this is why, this is just my pitch against the quantitative method. Yes, statistics are very good, but remarkable objects is based, the assumption of the book is that you can see things without counting them, that you can see trends that will then become prevalent if you get at something that is like a thread that you pull. And I think I pulled that thread by looking at Islamic object. What is it that I'm pulling at here? Women's literacy, the rise of the individual, the rise of the urban elites. Now, we all know here in this room that Jacob Burckhardt, writing in 1860 in the History of the Renaissance, says it happened in Italy in 1295 and later in Europe. Well, it didn't. It happened starting in 1204 in the north of Europe. So we have a family archive which precedes any other family archive in the region by more than a century. Again, I don't want to overstate my case. If you look at Paris and not Douai in the north, you can have mid-13th century, you can have an aristocratic family having 200 records. These people don't have 200 records, they may have 5 or 12. But nonetheless, there are records in French and in Latin. So this anticipates the regional creation of such archives by a century or sometimes 2 centuries, whether it's an aristocratic family or an urban family. And it also anticipates the context of creation of these archives, because people create archives, a century later. Again, this is massive, because they have a court case that they need to solve. There's a thorny succession battle, and they create the archive sort of in retrospect to document their case. Now, these people are amassing the archive all throughout, and it's mostly women doing that from 1204, the earliest document. So earlier than any family, they own these Islamic objects, they create that archive, they have books, and they also are authors of, tada, the first extant correspondence in France that is private. Because there's a lot of correspondence, right? It's public letters, political entities, people who rule, counts, kings, but this is not a ruling family. So these 2 brothers, one of them is in Italy, the other one is Douai. And another thing that is and there's a chapter on paper in the book, the other thing that is so fascinating to me, it goes again against every one of the assumptions that I had coming to this project. The brother who writes from Italy is writing on parchment. The brother who writes from Douai is writing on paper, 1298. So again, we see an overturning of what we thought we know about paper production and paper availability in Europe at the time. So the Muley men and women are canaries in the mine. And they, I would suggest, undermine a lot of the stereotypical assumptions and presumptions that we have about the period. And the way I discovered them is by looking at Islamic art objects in the possession of private families. So to sum up, to borrow from the brilliant historian of orphanages, diaspora, and slavery, Nicholas Terpstra, it's not the great numbers, but it's distinctly early European. That is, it's anticipating a prevailing trend. And so now very quickly, let me tell you about the 5 chapters of the book. So the first chapter is on metal. I'm sure you recognize this first item. It's this very beautiful metal basin in the Louvre. Writing in 1340s, Petrarch speaks about the taste for Islamic metal works as furor, obsession or madness. And the inventories of French kings and the Medici in the 14th century and the 15th bear out that phrase. There's hundreds of these objects there. They're mostly described as Damascene. And so this Mamluk basin is encrusted with gold and silver, enchanting figurative decoration, chinoiserie motifs. Originally was used, of course, for banquets to wash your hands. There are fish swimming in the bottom, and made of copper alloy in Damascus or Cairo. I think that's an interesting part of the Islamic art history that we say Damascus or Cairo. And in the first decades of the 1300s, what is particularly interesting about this piece is that it is signed not just once, because many Mamluk objects are signed. This is a very literate context. Pottery is signed, painting is signed, manuscript copies are signed, metal objects are signed, armor is signed. This thing is signed with big silver encrusted letters on the lip. It's also signed in miniature in several other places where normally the objects represented on this, it's a mise en abîme, right? Object would bear a miniature signature of the artist. So it's signed about 6 times. And I don't know of any other object that is signed that many times, so obviously important to the artist. There are other objects signed by the same name in other collections. And the figures are portrayed in action. I think one of the most endearing ones is this one here. Can you see the little bunny in the headlights right here? So this is, don't tell me there's no perspective in this art. It's very endearing. It's just beautiful. Processions and thrown figures and music. And we also see a lot of detail, a lot of fashion detail. For instance, here, this Mongol leggings decorated with these Mongol signs of clan belonging. So the fashion is very specific, depicted on this piece. And so it first appears in 1606 at the baptism of Louis XIII, who was 5 years old at the time, and it's in an account that's several decades later. It probably lives in the Vincennes at Sainte-Chapelle Treasure. There may be a mention of it in an inventory in 1440, but nobody has published it yet. Everybody talks about it, and nobody has published it yet. Sophie Makar, you mentioned it in one of her articles. And so it may have been there since the 15th century or earlier, or it may have arrived in the middle of the 16th. And of course, a book on these objects will have to have silk. So this is my silk chapter, along with other Byzantine and Islamic silk fragments preserved in Aix, Cologne, and other ecclesiastic treasuries. There is this one. And this is one of the earliest representations of elephants. So we have documented it from 1134, but we have here from 1120 this mosaic that also has elephants. So obviously there were other pieces of silk that represented elephants, both in Islamic, Byzantine, and in the French tradition at the time. It is particularly significant because we can date it because of this Kufic inscription, which names the patron, Abu Mansur Buktegin, and therefore we can date the object before his death, which happened in 961. So this probably came, we assume, through Byzantium. And it is first described in relation to Stephen, the future king of England, in 1134. He translates relics, he wraps up the piece of relics that he has taken to. It's like bread, right? You have to have a starter. So you have a relic that you wrap in this gorgeous silk brocade, and you establish a new sacred space, a monastery in this case. He establishes it in 1134, and so it has a very, very well-documented provenance from that point on, and was probably brought in from Byzantium. But not very far after it was made, if we know about it from 1134 and it was made before 961. So the third doesn't look very Islamic, I'm sure you will. Oh, and this is another funny thing, right? Sijil Massa, this very important center of trade, gold and ivory trade in the middle of Morocco, and Ganagobi, the fronton of the church in the south of France with this elephant mosaic lives. So the third is ivory. Of course, ivory. But why this piece of ivory? And it's mostly because I can't get away from it. You can't take your eyes away from it. I hope you agree, especially this panel on the right. So this is the goddess of night, obviously, with upturned torches. And on the right, you have somebody making a burnt offering. So Symmachus and Nicomachus, these two families were the pagan families, and Symmachus was particularly well known because he restored the altar that sat at the entrance to the Roman Senate. The Christians took it out, and he was leading the petition to put it back in because it wouldn't disturb Christians, and pagans on the Senate really needed it. So here's perhaps a reference to that actual historical event, and references that are visual. I was so fascinated with the wet drapery style. So it appears everywhere at every reuptake of the classical style in France. And here's, of course, the Fontaine des Innocents by Pierre Lescot, architect, and Goujon. And here's another parallel. So this is a Macedonian Renaissance Psalter, the so-called Paris Psalter. It came to Paris in 1560 from Byzantium. We even know that it was bought by a specific person, an ambassador who was in Constantinople for a few months. And so you see the same figure, the knight with upturned torches. And that Psalter, we know from other manuscripts after in Byzantium, was quite prolifically imitated. And so there must be some links of the chain we're missing in the transmission of this iconography. But again, this arrived in France in 1560, the one on the right. And it looks like this. It's a commentary to the Psalms. So the Psalm part is this very small part in the middle, and the commentary, of course, is the long commentary all around. One of the massively well-known and studied Macedonian Renaissance objects with 14 of these huge full-page illuminations. So moving on to glass. The glass kumkum, the sprinkler, the perfume sprinkler, the enameled glass. Here's a beautiful fragment that sort of evokes this douai cup I was talking about, widely imitated, sometimes faked. This technique has sort of defined Mamluk art, and it's especially particularly well known from lamps, right? A big object, they grow over the course of a century from about 1280 to 1380. They grow twice in size. They're bigger and bigger and harder to refire, as you can imagine, because they have to be made and then painted and then fired. So all of them are, when you look at museum website, you won't see it, but all of them are a little askew. They're always photographed as if they were symmetrical. This is why it's important to go to museums, students around here, because they're all photographed from their best side, right? So they look symmetrical, but none of them are. And quite an achievement. So this technique is really enchanting. And how similar, because the materials are similar, how similar then to the technique that we know that defines Gothic art, right? The colors are the same. And I didn't see it. This is why you have to do public lectures. Martina Saltamacchia, who worked on the Milan cathedral, said, oh, people wanted to own these small objects because they could own a piece of this grand object that they saw in their everyday life. The colors are the same material, and so the same color, the same transparency. And I agree with Martina. I think it's absolutely true. And the manuscript nomination also reflects that color scheme, not just in Europe, but also outside of Europe. So French inventories of the 1300s use standard terms for enameled glass. 3 descriptors, separate or together, from the generic description of enameled glass: decoration, ouvrait, à image, à diverses choses, peint, color, azur, very clearly, and the myth of origin, damas. But before it emerges in the 1300 inventories, glass appears much earlier in French literary texts. Glass and rock crystal are present at many critical moments in old French poetry. For instance, the lament at the death of Roland mentions his sword with its gold hilt and crystal pommel. Où est votre épée? Qui halte claire un nom, d'or et les helts, et de cristal les pontes. And sometimes in the 1200s, the visual memory of these enameled glass objects was echoed in the best known text and most translated text written in France in the late Middle Ages, The Romance of the Rose. In the first part of that poem, written by Guillaume de Loris, the narrator looks into the fountain or spring of Narcissus, where there are two crystals. When the sun's rays descend to the fountain and light up the crystals, they emit a rainbow of more than 100 colors, yellow, blue, and vermilion, jaune and vermeil. The crystal has the power of reflecting everything in the surrounding garden, trees, flowers, and the rest in order, even the smallest detail, as if it was painted on the crystal, comme si elle erre au cristal portrait. But in French, so I am sure that this text, I'm now seeing things, of course, as somebody who's written a book on them, but I'm sure this text sort of evokes the circulation of these small objects in the families other than Mulet, I would assume. So rock crystal in French, in Middle French, in Old French, is cristal or béricle, and the glass is ware or ware de cristal. The medieval encyclopedia on properties of things explains that crystal is a shiny and clear rock, the color of water, because it's made of snow or ice hardened by many years. Cristal est une pierre reluisant et claire qui a couleur de eau, car elle est engendrée de neige ou de la glace endurcie par moult de temps. And that's a translation by Jean Corbichon for Charles V in 1372. Those of you who studied Rabelais have certainly read this beautiful passage where the narrator hears the sound of battle, which was frozen in ice. And as the ice melts, the sound is being released. That passage is definitely inspired by the story that makes glass the product of a long maturing of ice. In Old French, bérique then becomes bésicle and the word for glasses. So even though these enameled glass shell and coconut cups are in the minority in Marguerite's wills, among the more numerous vessels of silver, gilts, and wood, a proportion borne out by museum collections today, I think that they tell us a lot about the greater, more common presence of these objects. I'm going to conclude. So another measure of So throughout this book, I've been hoping to show that the French and Afro-Eurasian cultures are not a binary, but rather that permeate and belong to each other. And although medieval connected Afro-Eurasian world of trade and luxury object does not mean that France at the time was a multicultural society explicit about the ideal of mutual respect and appreciation like ours, nonetheless, the knowledge about these objects can help us change our mind about the place of medieval Islamic and Jewish art in medieval Europe. I hope that the book will help us bring them out of the Oriental category. Why are Jewish Hebrew manuscripts Oriental if they're European? That it will help us bring them out of the Oriental category where they're sequestered in library catalogs and museum wings, and show them to our students as French, at the same time foregrounding their specific regional and political origins, their makers, trade routes, circumstances of their exchange and reuse in France. Indeed, research on the book enabled me to better learn 14th centuries and 3 continents of Islamic art, and forced me, a medievalist in French, to become better acquainted with Hebrew and Greek alphabets, Ge'ez and Coptic manuscripts, Fatimid rock crystal vessels, and Persian literature. Thank you.
Right, we have time for about 10 minutes of questions, and I'm going to circulate the microphone. Does anybody have a question?
Thank you so much for a great talk, and it's fun to see all these beautiful artworks. I really liked the idea at the start of your talk when you were talking about the 4 kind of principles of the book. I think we were all struck by the idea of not claiming, a hybrid object or something as part one thing and part another thing, but entirely each thing. I was just wondering if you could unpack that a little more for a particular object. I mean, if we take, say, the Eleanor vase in the Louvre, which has, part rock crystal from Egypt or Iran and part, a mounting made in northern France in the 12th century. you're sort of suggesting that to someone like Sujet, it would have seemed like an entirely Islamic object and also an entirely Christian object, and these two things can coexist rather than seeing them as parts? Or I just was wondering if you could flesh out a bit more about how you apply that great idea of things not being just parts, but actually a whole to a particular object.
Yes, I think that for me, I think that this ivory was the most, like I wanted to find out how could this piece with her boobs out and her belly button showing. Look at the belly button right here. Like it really makes me cry. This absolute gorgeous ivory. And by the way, this one I looked at it very, very. Oops, sorry. I looked at it very close. I looked at it very closely, and the one on the right, sometimes people say it's an 18th century copy because there was an inventory in the early 1700s, and that's the woodcut on the right that represents that, right, the sketch that somebody made. So again, I'm thinking of Nicholas Terpstra non-quantitative approach, right? What I am writing a book about is the things that I cannot stop loving or thinking about. And obviously, I'm not the only one, right? I'm not that special. So my question was, how is that hanging out as a reliquary door on the altar in Montier-en-Der, which is like north of Dijon? What work is it doing there? And what work maybe at a certain point in time? And this is a roundabout sort of answer, because Montier-en-Der is also a site, it's on one of the thoroughfares of the Roman trade, even though it's kind of in the middle of nowhere now, very rural. But there's a big villa, so there's a lot more classical stuff there. That's where Montaigne goes and stops on his trip to Germany and Italy. And that's where he writes his 3 non-binary stories: Joan of Arc, Marie Germain, and a dozen of people in that area who lived as men and were later, punished for it. So why this concentration of this very strange behavior in this particular place, and why this naked lady on the altar for centuries there? Without a time machine, we won't know, of course, but I think that there's something about these objects that's sticky, right? And that stickiness transcends cultural divides. Whether you're Muslim or Christian, you're still going to have this on the altar. So I wanted to, personally, I wanted to know, like, how come? I mean, isn't it ridiculous to have the Christian relics wrapped in this cloth, which has Indian motifs, which has Central Asian camels, which has simurgs, the Persian mythical bird. So how does that work? How does it work culturally? And why did we forget that these objects are operative? Why did we forget that France is a multilingual, multi-script medieval world? Okay, and here I'm just saying, I'm learning it for myself. I just took a class in Judeo French, because we all know when we learn French that the first 1,000 words in French are written in Hebrew characters. But has anybody studied that in their French class? No. And so I want to be able to study that, to teach that. And I think that a new understanding of medieval culture will emerge from that process. I don't have answers, but I think my students will. Does it answer your question at all?
Wonderful.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. I wanted to ask maybe a broader question, because I'm a great admirer of your study of trans and queer history. And I was also very intrigued by your sort of opening list of methods. So I was just sort of curious if you wanted to reflect on, like, moving from sort of queer study to this sort of global medieval, right, or transcultural study, if there are any particular methods that you found intersectionally useful.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for this question. It is so brilliant. And let me look at this slide, which I haven't really talked about. which has the, so this is really particular to me. Can you see the signature here at the bottom? Can you read? Can anyone read this signature right here? It's de l'Aubépine. De l'Aubépine. L'Aubépine is my author from 15, you know, she was born in 3 years after this letter was drafted and signed by her father, who was a minister to the French king. Her brother, Claude III de l'Aubépine, also was. There's thousands of letters countersigned with their name, de l'Aubépine. And she is a lesbian, out lesbian poet in the 1570s. She writes about orgasms, she writes about having sex with women, she writes about you know, being jealous of some woman's male partner. I mean, obviously that's fiction, right? This is poetry. This is not, you know, we don't have access to her real life, but that's the fiction she creates. So again, you pull a thread of Islamic art, and this is what you end up with. This is so this is just to show the correspondence between Francis I and his contemporary. They were born the same year, Suleiman the Magnificent, and they start in 1494. And Suleiman lives a little longer, dies in 66. And there is that correspondence that we never knew about until like maybe 5 years ago, when the people at the French Library said, "Oh, maybe this is a thing that we could feature on our blog." And they started posting intensely about this collection of letters that they have at the French Royal Library. So, so that's my answer, maybe, right? That one thing leads to another, but they're all connected. Okay, this sounds really strange, but Saint-Bercaire, the dude who may or may not have brought this ivory plaque from Byzantium or Jerusalem in the plaque, which was made in 490, and he lived in 620, 690. He died on March 28th, which is, right? It's funny, right? It makes you laugh. But, you know, why did people write about it constantly, about bringing these things from Syria? So his life is written by Abbot of Abbot of Montierandais, Adso, and who died in Greece on the way to Jerusalem, and finished by his successor Bruno. So 490, 620 to 90, and then 900s, where they're writing this story about it being brought from Syria. So they're obsessed with it. And yes, of course, art historians have always studied them. And yes, of course, they've always said, oh, this is just tchotchke from the Holy Land. But I think that there's a more nuanced story to discover if we actually look at people who brought them. Who are the actual people, and what were they doing? Does it answer your question? Okay, one more story, one more anecdote about L'Aubépine and her lovers. So she had a number of people who were connected to her by these satirical songs that everybody makes about, you know, ladies at court. One of her lovers actually traveled to Jerusalem and is the author of, if you're Moldovan in the audience, the author of the first Western European account of Moldova. And he also went to Poland. He was really shocked at how well people speak Latin in all the inns in Poland. And he writes, it's not published, so his journal from the trip is in the French Library. And, you know, nobody can publish everything, but there's a wonderful image of him on a ship in the Mediterranean, looking at this guy with 3 husbands who are fighting like cats over the favors of this merchant. And he's like, it's interesting. And then he goes to Cairo and goes to coffee houses. And we have this very, very common account of people's makeup and manicure and what they do in coffee houses. So there are all these culturally interesting moments when you get out of your own context, right? And these people, if you start looking at Islamic art, you instantly encounter people who walk out of their context. When do queer people walk out of their family? When they can't live there, right? So I think we can encounter more queer people if we start looking at Islamic art for that reason.
Okay, I believe we have time for a final question.
Thank you so much. This was just, I love looking at images. So you've talked a lot about objects coming to France and these objects kind of showing up here. I'm wondering, is there an object case of it going the other way, right? Like you talk about it's not a binary, that there's a porosity, there's a relationship there. So do we have things that are going back or going elsewhere?
Yes, of course. So for the metal, for instance, you know, and this is all art historians. So I may have mentioned that, for instance, some velvets, late medieval velvets have been just in the last 10 years reassigned. They were considered Islamic, and now we know they're Italian instead. So there's such a porosity, in fact, of manufacturing techniques and patterns that we didn't know at the time, but now with spectroscopy and other, you know, physics and chemistry in the lab, we can sort of determine more where these materials come from, and so we can trace things that we don't have the provenance record for. Another example is metalwork, right? So the metalwork comes from Syria and Egypt, from Africa and Asia, right, to Europe in the 14th century, and then something switches around, you know, 1400. The massive production of smaller objects, less exquisite objects, so not luxury trade, but just trade, massive amounts going to Africa and Asia. Paper, same story. At first, Europe is supposed to import paper from Byzantium, but very quickly, Italy is exporting paper to Byzantium, and even people make watermarks that look like crescents to sell better in North Africa and Ethiopia. So we see it's a churning. I think the more we know, the more we see it as a tourbillon, a churn, rather than, you know, things going, you know, these trade maps will become these vortices, I think, as we go along. But I think my favorite example is those Merovingian garnets, like Rajasthan, right? Yeah. Oh, and another story. Okay, one more story. So Raman spectroscopy, which is used to determine where these things come from, because that gives you a very accurate idea of sort of the profile, structural profile of the material. He came up with the idea because he was in the Mediterranean. He was invited to work at Oxford, Raman, the great physicist, and he looked at sort of he had a theory about why Mediterranean is blue that led to, you know, step by step, the theory and the actual lab application and the development of spectroscopy. In like 3 years, he got the Nobel Prize for that idea. So look at sparkly objects is my advice to everyone.
It's a wonderful way to conclude this presentation. Thank you so much. All right, thank you so much for being here today. I believe there is a conversation hour, so after this lecture, so please stay for that. Come see me if you have any questions about this. Please also stay for a reception during which we can continue the conversation with our guest. And also, I invite you all to come back on April 18th for the final event of the Center of Excellence Lecture Series, a presentation with Professor Thierry Bouncuiller from Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you so much for being here tonight.